Hello and welcome to this edition of Middle East Now on I24 News. The headlines this hour. A series of alleged Israeli airstrikes hit multiple targets overnight in Syria, a chemical weapons factory believed to be among the targets. A Hezbollah drone slams into the side of a high-rise apartment building in the Israeli city of Nahariya. And Russia's foreign minister meets with the Saudi crown prince at the GCC summit in Riyadh. And we begin with a series of overnight airstrikes on military targets in Syria. Israel has not commented on the strikes, but they are believed to be part of preparations for a wider war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osseran has this report.
An unusual series of airstrikes rocked western Syria early Monday. Syrian state media accused Israel of launching 4 waves of airstrikes on various areas in the Syrian countryside.
We were sitting at home when we heard an explosion. We went out to see what happened. I was told that blocks from the building had fallen on my car and that the windshield and rear window were completely broken. Thank God nothing serious happened.
At least 15 missiles struck targets in Homs, Hama, Tartus, and Masyaf, home to the Syrian Scientific Studies and Research Center, known as SIRS. This is where Hezbollah and Iran's Revolutionary Guard develops short and medium-range precision missiles and drones. Official state media claimed some of the missiles were intercepted. Syrian opposition media said 25 people were killed in the airstrikes, marking the deadliest attack in Syria attributed to Israel since the war began in October. 5 of the casualties were civilians and the rest Syrian soldiers or members of pro-Iranian militias. 32 others were wounded. Israel did not comment on the strikes.
We strongly condemn this criminal attack by the Zionist regime on Syrian soil. We believe that the time has long come for the supporters of the regime to stop arming the regime. We deny allegations by some Zionist-affiliated media about an Iranian-backed or Iranian-dependent center having been attacked.
Despite taking a back seat in the current conflict against Israel, Syria continues to serve Hezbollah and Iranian proxies as a hub for storing and producing weapons. The targeting of such sites is believed to set the stage for a broader conflict in Lebanon that could erupt at a moment's notice.
Well, with me in the studio this hour, the journalist behind that report, Ariel Osseran, our Middle East correspondent, and Ruth Wasserman-Land, former member of the Knesset, research fellow at the Misgav Institute for Strategic Studies, and a former diplomatic envoy in Cairo as well. Good evening to you, Ruth. Ariel, I'll start with you. If I may, last time Israel was blamed for carrying out a major attack in Syria, that was the killing of an Iranian general in Damascus back in April, Iran responded by firing hundreds of missiles at Israel. Can we expect any such response this time around?
I don't think so in this case, because that strike on the consulate in Damascus was seen as a breach of Iranian sovereignty, given that diplomatic facilities such as consulate or embassy are seen as sovereign territory. And so Iran presented this as a strike on its sovereignty, and it needed to respond as such. This is not the case, even though it is believed, according to Syrian opposition media, that this current strike among the dead were also Iranian advisors. We're not really sure how many, but we know that there were multiple operatives who were serving pro-Iranian militia, whether they were Syrians working for Hezbollah or whether they were simply Syrian soldiers working alongside pro-Iranian militia. So that was seen as a strike on Iranian soil, on Iranian territory. This is not the case here, and so I wouldn't expect to see a response in the same severity. More likely, this is just another link in a chain of attacks attributed to Israel against Iranian, pro-Iranian assets in Syria. And for most of those strikes, perhaps even all of them, we did not see Iran kind of break the mold in its retaliation. All
right, thanks, Ariel. And Ruth, Iranian operatives, Hezbollah operatives, part of a chemical weapons factory targeted in these overnight airstrikes. I mean, what does this reveal about just how embedded in Syria Iran's military infrastructure and the military support it provides to its proxies is in Syria?
I think we didn't need this particular attack to know that the Iranians have been exerting a lot of pressure on the envelope of Israel. They have Shiite militias in Syria. They've been there for a while. In fact, recently there's been more movement and more aid to those militias in Syria by Iran in order to aid the so-called Hezbollah effort from Lebanon. But there have been Shiite militias in Syria for a long time, also Shiite militias in Iraq. Of course, we know of the Houthis, we have the Hezbollah, we have Hamas in Lebanon as well. And apart from that, we also have, of course, a flaring, I would say, support by Iran in the West Bank and in Jordan itself via certain factors, particularly Palestinian in Jordan, but not only against Israel, but for the sake of destabilizing the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom and creating yet another good platform for Iran to impact its own influence in.
So Israel literally under attack on all sides from all of these Iranian proxies. Ariel, why is this being seen on the part of Israel as preparation for a wider war with Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Because a lot of these sites that were targeted are seen as not only storage facilities for weapons, but also sites that amplify precision of short and medium distance range missiles. And so given that Syria is pretty much seen as the arms depot of Hezbollah, the rear storage facilities, but also the sites of amplifying existing weapons and the back line and the rear of the forces. This is believed to be sites that hold weapons that are intended as reinforcement for Hezbollah in a time of war. Usually most of the strikes that we see in Syria attributed to Israel are mainly weapons transfers or specific warehouses. This is more a missile precision site. I think that is an indication of an attempt by Israel. Again, Israel has not commented, but if this was carried out by Israel, it would be an attempt to try and undermine Hezbollah's reinforcement capabilities that are to be expected to come from Syria in a time of increased inflagration with Israel.
Okay, Ariel and Ruth, for now, thank you very much. Well, a Hezbollah drone slammed into the side of a high-rise apartment block in the northern city of Nahariya this morning. There were no casualties, but damage inside this apartment block. The terrorist group claimed it was targeting a nearby military base. Well, let's go to Nahariya now. We're joined by our correspondent, Robert Swift. Robert, it was a miracle that no one was hurt.
Yeah, it was a fair amount of damage to the building itself, and this isn't a building or a town where the population are evacuated from. We bumped into a lot of residents, many of them families with young children, whilst we were reporting from the site there. And it was actually the children who were coming out and trying to give us information and forcing interviews upon us during the course of us filming there. The damage was to two different apartments. There was the one apartment which sustained the main impact of the explosion from the drone, with the drone penetrating through the wall, and it's understood damaging one room inside that apartment. Fortunately, it was a bathroom, and therefore there was no casualties. A second apartment next door to it was also received some minor damage. That apartment, fortunately, was empty, and the landlord told us that they had just last night rented that apartment out to somebody. So it could have been a worse scene, that's for sure.
The new tenants weren't home, I take it. Well, as you point out, Rob, Nahariya has not been evacuated despite its proximity to the border with Lebanon, unlike many other communities across the north of Israel. Are there any plans to change that following this attack?
No, not as we have heard no information in line with that. And to be honest, if Nahariya was to be evacuated, you're talking about a sizable portion of the northern population being evacuated. If the evacuation was to come this far south, it's worth remembering that most of the communities evacuated are within about 5 kilometres of the border. We can see the border with Lebanon from where we're standing, but it's a bit further than 5 kilometres. There are many communities, for various reasons, within that 5 kilometres that have not been evacuated, and there are a sizable number of places like Nahariya which are just beyond that line. They are within range of some weapons that Hezbollah has, but they haven't been evacuated. Now, it's worth, if we cast our minds back about a month or so, when tensions were rising between Hezbollah and the IDF, an intelligence document passed by the IDF to the mayors of communities in the north, it talked about the necessary evacuations that would take place if full-scale war was to erupt between the IDF and Hezbollah. And it was talking about a major evacuations of locations like where we're standing now. That isn't the situation at present, and despite the dangers that this drone earlier today represented, we're not in that situation just quite yet.
Rob, thank you very much. Robert Swift there up in Nahariya. Israel's Defence Minister Yoav Gallant has been meeting with the US CENTCOM chief, General Michael Kurilla, today to discuss strategy regarding Iran and Hezbollah. This as former cabinet member Benny Gantz says now is the time for Israel to turn its attentions to the north. More in this report by our Emmanuel Honora.
And the time of north has come, and actually I think we are late on this.
According to former Security Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz, that should be Israel's next move. Over the weekend, Gantz was in Washington, D.C., making the case for Israel at the annual summit advancing Middle East-American dialogue.
And I think that we should seek to have a deal to get our hostages out, but if we cannot get it in the coming time, I would say, I wouldn't limit it to days or a few weeks or whatever it is, we should go up north and take care and make sure we can get our people back to their homes. And I don't think we should delay it anymore.
Meanwhile, to help monitor the regional situation, IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi met with the Chief of the U.S. Army Central Command, General Michael Eric Kurilla, who arrived in Israel on Sunday. Halevi over the weekend also signaled Israel's plans to take the war to South Lebanon in order to fight Hezbollah. The region has been watching with bated breath Israel and Hezbollah's next move since October 8th, when Hezbollah decided to join Hamas in its war against Israel. Since then, both sides have been on the precipice of war, only waiting for one wrong push. In spite of Lebanon's official desire to stay out of a war with Israel, on Saturday night, the Lebanese Foreign Minister Abdullah Abu Habib told Al Jazeera that Israel passed a message through intermediaries indicating it is not interested in a ceasefire in Lebanon, even after one is reached with Hamas in Gaza.
All right, well, in the last hour, reports have emerged that Israeli police have seized dozens of handguns that were being smuggled into Israel from Jordan. This was across the Rabin crossing in the south of Israel, close to the city of Eilat. That is not the Allenby Bridge crossing, where there was a terrorist attack yesterday. 3 Israeli border guards murdered by a Jordanian citizen who came across from Jordan and shot the 3 dead. Ruth Wasserman-Land, you've written extensively about the threats coming from coming from Iran via Jordan and into the West Bank, and we've seen, of course, a hugely volatile situation in the last few months with the IDF really trying to get a grip on the terrorist groups there.
I would say that, first of all, this is a continuation and the long hand of Iran, not for the past few months, but rather for the past few years, using Jordan as a platform via which to smuggle weapons and drugs to the Hezbollah in Lebanon and to Syria. And this has been known as a fact, but to a certain degree overlooked, also by the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom. And the reason is that it didn't want to open a front with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, Jordan has a very clear interest in security cooperation with Israel, not out of love, but out of necessity. One, for the water that Israel provides Jordan and its citizens, but also for the security and stability and continuity of the current regime in Jordan. And this is very important as an enclave of stability, so-called, for the West, for Europe, for the United States
of American aid, of course.
Exactly, I was just about to say, and also to prevent Iran from having continuous territorial control from Iran over Iraq and all the way to Lebanon and Syria. So it's kind of an enclave of, if you wish, sanity. But this enclave of sanity has 70 to 80% Palestinian population, and Iran has been trying its hardest with weapons, with incitement, with funding, and with encouragement to incite those masses, not only to strengthen the Hamas, but in fact to attack Israel and to simply take over the border guarded by Jordanian guards and soldiers, by those masses, those Palestinian masses. But this is a huge danger to the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom itself. Now, the Jordanians well understand that, but they have not done anything in the past 30-odd years to stop the incitement, to stop the education, which is horrifically insightful against the West and against Israel.
What can they do? I mean, we saw...
Change the education.
Well, we saw on social media last night, Ruth, you know, scenes of celebration in Amman and other Jordanian cities.
This is a result of decades of incitement and indoctrination. The same thing is happening...
In the school system.
In the school system, in the messaging system. This is opposite to the interest of the Hashemite kingdom and the regime. But they've been too weary to take that up. Likewise in Egypt to a lesser degree, but of course very similarly to the West Bank and to Gaza, there's a huge amount of incitement and indoctrination, and this is key to any kind of agreement or future stability. If there will be one, this has to be made away with.
And Ariel, we saw other scenes on social media last night. These were armed men in the West Bank, and this just a day after the IDF concluded a very intense period of battles with Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants in the West Bank. I mean, has that IDF operation had any impact at all?
Well, the immediate goal of this operation was to thwart impending attacks that the intelligence community alerted security services of. And so there were two main objectives. One, to remove the immediate threat originating from those areas. And the second, a more strategic goal to try and give another blow to these local terror organizations that have really taken over the northern West Bank as kind of different terror nests in these areas. That objective was not met. It wasn't met also in previous operations that had that same objective. And so I think the IDF, albeit concluded its operation in the area, it most likely won't be the last. I just want a quick note on what we talked about regarding Jordan. I think tomorrow is an interesting test for Jordan, given the general elections for parliament there. There's a concern that there will be a resurgence of or success for Islamist elements, for anti-West elements to increase their positioning in parliament, further straining the cooperation that the Hashemite royal court does maintain with Israel, because we are seeing this discrepancy has been going on for years between the position of the king, the top leadership, and their alignment of security interests with Israel, and the sentiment in the street that as the war in Gaza prolongs is going further and further away from the position of the top leadership and more against Israel.
All right. Thank you both. Chances of a deal with Hamas to free the remaining hostages in Gaza are now close to zero. That's according to unnamed Israeli security officials who are being cited today in Israeli media. The source claims that both sides have hardened their positions and the US administration, increasingly focused on elections, is out of ideas. Bianca Zanini reports.
The bustling city of Tel Aviv once again brought to a halt as large groups of protesters took over the streets, blocking traffic and demanding the Israeli government secure a ceasefire for hostages deal in Gaza.
What we see over the last week is that the hostages are dying, actually being murdered. The families are getting sick and are suffering, and the entire Israel is sick. The only medicine is to bring back the hostages.
But according to new reports, Israeli negotiators say the chances of an agreement reached on the basis of Israel's May proposal, which has been on the table for the past 3 months, are, quote, close to zero. The unnamed sources in the Israeli security establishment also reported broad pessimism and say that even the U.S. is now unlikely to follow through on its plan to present a new bridging proposal in the next few days. According to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been widely criticized for not doing enough to reach a deal, the Israeli public stands united in the war against Hamas.
Newspaper Bild published an official Hamas document that reveals its plan of action: to sow division within us, to wage psychological warfare on the families of the hostages, to exert internal and external political pressure on the Israeli government to tear us apart from the inside, and to continue the war until further notice. Until further notice means the defeat of Israel. The vast majority of Israeli citizens do not fall into this trap of Hamas. They know that we are committed with all our might to achieving the goals of the war.
But after 11 months of war and with no end in sight, not everyone is on the same page. Less than 2 weeks ago, Hamas murdered 6 hostages right before they could be rescued by the IDF, adding fuel to the fire of fearful and frustrated family members.
We came to say to the war cabinet that they must get the right decision and sign a deal that will get our son out of the hell.
As hope once again fades for a deal that would halt the war and return the hostages, protests continue throughout Israel.
All right, and Ruth Wasserman-Land remains with us in the studio. We're also joined by Khaled Hassan, Egyptian-born, London-based counter-terrorism expert who is in Israel, I believe, for the first time, and also at the I24 News studios for the first time. So welcome, Khaled.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Welcome,
it's delightful being here.
And as I say, you were born and raised in Cairo. You have a very interesting story. You live in the UK now, where you work, as I say, as a counter-terrorism expert. First of all, what are your first impressions being here in Israel at this very difficult time?
It's really making me angry, because I feel like Israel is such a beautiful country, and I have seen things that I have never seen anywhere else in the Middle East. I think when I was telling a friend of mine that I can, as an Egyptian, stand in the middle of the road in Tel Aviv and say, listen, I don't like Bibi. I want Bibi gone. Nobody would do anything to me. That's the kind of free speech that you get. Yes.
Particularly in Tel Aviv.
Yes, exactly. I wouldn't say that, because I think Bibi is doing amazingly well, actually. That's that's my opinion on the talks. But I'm saying just the fact that you have this free speech for an Egyptian whose nation has been against Israel and fighting against Israel for decades. Mm-hmm. And that's fascinating, if you ask me. So I think Israel has given me things that I have not seen anywhere else in the Middle East. And that's how I feel.
You say you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing a good job on the hostage talks. Of course, we've had no result in those talks. 101 hostages are still being held in Gaza. I just want to ask you, though, about Egypt's position, because we heard once again today, I think it was the foreign minister who criticised Netanyahu, again saying that he is the one to blame for the fact that there still is no deal, and also saying once again Egypt's official position, no idea about the tunnels going under the Philadelphia corridor, which connects Gaza to Egypt. What are your thoughts on that? Why do the Egyptians persist in maintaining this view?
Well, I think you have to understand that Egypt's strategic significance in the region is related to its actual role in the negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. So if Israelis take over the border, then that's strategic significance to the U.S.
That's
to the
the
EU.
leverage.
Yes, that's the
that
leverage.
Egypt has over Hamas. Yeah.
Yes, so if it's gone, then Egypt's position will really be undermined hugely. So that's why they want the Israelis to leave Rafah, they want the Israelis to leave the Philadelphia corridor, because it means that Egypt will get back its leverage. The tunnels is, I would say, what did you expect? That's the challenge. When it comes to actually having negotiations, when it comes to having a grown-up conversation about serious issues, unfortunately, most Arab countries, with the exception of the UAE and Saudi Arabia and some countries in the Gulf, it's just denial. We don't know about this. We don't know what's happening. And I think this is the issue. It just doesn't make sense. You need to address issues, and you need to admit, if it is about ineptitude, you need to say, listen, we were just inept, that we couldn't actually detect some of these tunnels. If it was about criminal activity and it was done by some tribes in Sinai, you need to say, listen, it's that we believe is the case.
And Ruth, does that concur with your own experience of working in Cairo?
I spent 3 years living in Cairo as an Israeli Jewish woman, so the epitome of all evil in one. It's very interesting about Egypt really saying that they have no idea about the tunnels, that there are no tunnels. In 2014, they did indeed take significant steps to flood the tunnels. And then it seemed as if there was some kind of an understanding between the Egyptian regime and Hamas regarding how helpful Hamas would be to certain unfriendly elements in the Sinai Peninsula toward the Egyptian regime or ISIS or other terrorist entities. Whatever the agreement or understanding or clandestine sort of perception was, there were tunnels that were found, some of which were not blocked. And under those tunnels or in those tunnels, there was smuggling of some weapons, but a lot of the smuggling was happening also above ground, in other words, in the actual Rafah crossing. So there was smuggling above and smuggling below. So I would say that one of the reasons that the Egyptians would want to have full control over that passage without Israeli presence would be, of course, the leverage that you spoke of. I completely agree. But another one would be also the continuation of that smuggling for whatever reason. I don't want to impose.
Let's take a short break. Thank you, Ruth. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back right after this. Stay with us.
Sale for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad, with renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayazad.fr.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back. Qatar has signed a deal with the UN Agency for the Palestinians, UNRWA. Doha will send $4.5 million to Gazans that Qatar say are stranded in the West Bank following the outbreak of war. Israel has provided proof that UNRWA workers took part in the October 7th massacre, and numerous countries suspended their funding to UNRWA as a result. There are also broader concerns about UNRWA's institutional incitement against Israel. Well, to talk more about all of that, we're joined by Hossein Abdul Hussein, Research Fellow at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracy. Good to see you, Hussein. Thank you for joining us. So this money will not go to Palestinians in Gaza, but Gazans who are in the West Bank. This will be of some concern to Israel, which is currently battling Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists in the West Bank. Can everyone be sure that the money will go to the right people?
Well, first of all, if it's going to UNRWA, no one knows where it goes after that. We know that a big chunk of staff of UNRWA work for Hamas and many other Palestinian factions, and this has been the case since the agency was founded 75 years ago. The second thing is that it's really interesting to see Qatar hand the money to UNRWA in the West Bank instead of handing it over to the Palestinian Authority. We know that the Palestinian Authority does subsidize healthcare and schooling, and it also provides stipends to many Palestinians. So the fact that Doha would rather give the money to UNRWA but not to the Palestinian Authority is really interesting to me, and suggests that, unlike what Doha says, it's not really interested in a two-state solution. It only sponsors and funds Hamas.
To what extent, Hussein, has Qatar managed to paint itself as a kind of champion of the Palestinians, whereas other Arab countries like Egypt, like Jordan, like Saudi Arabia are being accused of not doing enough to help them?
Well, I think, given that Qatar gave the money to UNRWA but not to the Palestinian Authority, it doesn't suggest that Qatar supports all Palestinians. Qatar picks and chooses. It sponsors Hamas. To a lesser extent, it supports Islamic Jihad, which we know is an Iranian militia. So Qatar does not support all Palestinians. It picks and chooses amongst them. It picks favorites. And more often than not, it ends up speaking on behalf of Hamas, like we see during these talks that are taking place, the indirect talks with Israel and Egypt.
And there has been, hasn't there, a lot of financial and political pressure on UNRWA since October 7th. But it does seem to be slowly but surely restoring its reputation and indeed its funding. Most countries have now restored funding to the organisation. Can we imagine that UNRWA will just remain linked to the Palestinian cause indefinitely now?
Well, it has definitely restored its funding. It certainly has not restored its reputation. I think its reputation has been tarnished beyond repair. We all have seen a list of UNRWA staffers either fighting with Hamas or housing Hamas or aiding and abetting Hamas. So I think these images are here to stay. We all know that UNRWA is not a separate entity. It's part and parcel of the Palestinian society, and the Palestinian society has a big chunk of it that are partisans of Hamas. So granted that they've got the money back, and I think countries are thinking if we don't give them the money, maybe there'll be hunger or famine or more poverty. But I don't think these countries are under any illusion that the money they're giving it to an independent agency of the UN.
Hossein Abdul Hussein at the FTD, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, with me in the studio this hour, Ruth Wasserman Land, former member of the Knesset, and Khaled Hassan, counter-terrorism expert. Thank you for staying with us, both of you. So, Ruth, I mean, even after Israel provided such grim examples, such as the fact that UNRWA workers kidnapped the body of a murdered IDF soldier, they participated in the massacre, they were there on October 7th, they are restoring their reputation, aren't they?
Unfortunately, we live in an upside-down world. It doesn't seem that facts are very much of interest neither to the UN, which has become a body really infested with entities protecting those who hurt human rights rather than the exact opposite for which it was founded earlier on in the former century, after horrible atrocities had been performed in the Second World War. It's just unbelievable that Qatar is still funding Palestinian causes that have been proven, not only UNRWA, but in general, it is directly supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. And we see many interesting things happening in the Middle East because of a weakness of a significant power in the international arena coming down very strongly on those let's say, supportive of terrorism kind of acts. And that is the weakness of the United States of America, unfortunately. And this is something that everybody responds to. For example, Egypt coming to visit Turkey, its a long-term arch enemy. Sisi and Erdogan meeting in order to coordinate regional issues. Erdogan being known as the supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, the arch enemy of the stability of the Egyptian regime. So we see many things not as they had been in the Middle East because of the weakness of the international arena in the West, led by the United States of America.
And Khaled, this is a kind of a blind spot for the West, isn't it, UNRWA? Despite all the evidence they've been provided with, they just want UNRWA to take the money, deal with the plight of the Palestinians. They don't want to deal with the issue of incitement. They don't want to deal with the fact that UNRWA workers are members of Hamas. I mean, until people get to grips with that, can you see any kind of future for the Palestinians?
It's very challenging because I think what happens in the West is you have people and leaders who are very scared of making a difficult decision. So they would rather actually give the money and say, listen, we've given the Palestinians the money they need. Now we've done our part, you know, and basically that's it. Because they don't want protests. They don't want anyone saying, listen, you're complicit in genocide. I think the future of Palestinians needs to be decided by Palestinians. They need to understand and accept that they have to announce that the war on Jews comes to an end. I think this is the beginning of a future for Palestinians. We haven't seen this. We haven't actually seen this yet, and that's really quite remarkable because you have Mahmoud Abbas giving a speech in the Turkish parliament and still suggesting martyrdom or victory. So he's suggesting the same jihadist doctrine is going to continue, which is basically we're in the same. Yes, exactly. We're in the same position, and he is the moderate. So what do you think Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad would do? They still haven't said we're not going to do another October 7th. So I don't think there is a future for Palestinians as long as this continues.
And I just want to ask you as well, because you live in London, I mean, what has it been like for you over the past few months to see these protests week after week on the streets of the British capital with people declaring openly their support for terrorist groups?
Yes, and the challenge is you have the police sometimes arresting some people and then releasing them, or sometimes giving them a suspended sentence. And I think we have those terrorists and basically, well, terrorist enablers in a way because they support terrorism. And they walk freely on the streets of London. And I think what we see is really quite unheard of and unprecedented because you have the police, the Met Police, openly admitting that according to its own findings, they are failing on every single front when it comes to actually policing and security. And then the police, we just don't feel safe in London anymore. And that's the challenge. We just don't. Whether it's criminality, whether it's terrorism, whether it's calls for jihad from the centre of London, that's what we see week after week.
And we're hearing it's now putting tourists off as well, actually.
Well, absolutely, yes.
Today, yes. People are really having second thoughts about visiting London because specifically of these protests. Well, let's stay in the UK because the British state broadcaster, the BBC, has come under fire for breaching its own impartiality rules when it comes to Israel. According to research led by the British lawyer Trevor Assison, the BBC has been far from neutral in its coverage of the war with Hamas. And Khaled, you were actually part of that team that put together this research. Tell us a bit about what you found.
Yes, so I was the contributor basically who led the research on the Arabic side, because obviously there is BBC Arabic, which is very problematic to say the least. What we found that basically BBC, especially BBC Arabic, platforms terrorists, does not provide information on who they are, their affiliations are. So if you have somebody from the BBC, if you have somebody like me who is a Zionist, you should say, listen, Khaled Hassan is a Zionist, which makes perfect sense because that's a fact. The audience need to understand this. But when you present somebody who's a terrorist and say, we have a Palestinian Gazan reporter who is reporting on atrocities allegedly committed by the IDF, and my research finds that this guy is actually related, he has family relations, his uncle, his mom's brother, is a senior leader in the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And he praised and participated in October 7th directly. Him and his family and people around him. And he's being presented by the BBC as an innocent, impartial
just a witness
reporter.
And the worst thing is that the BBC is absolutely and fully funded by the United Kingdom, which is completely insane because that is the taxpayers' money.
You have to pay the license fee. If you have a TV,
exactly.
you have to have a license fee.
That's why I'm stressing it. This is insanity because this is the UK government. It's absolutely and completely warped by any standards.
And it's not just the BBC, to be fair, is it? I mean, as you say, the BBC is funded by the public, but it is a global problem. The way
it is. It absolutely is. But I think what we find to be most challenging, our report actually finds that the BBC's complaint system is almost useless. It does not produce any impartial investigations. And what's really challenging about this is when you look at the data and you look at the BBC's immediate response to the report was basically criticize the methodology. So saying, no, we're not really sure about that methodology. We have serious question about the methodology. How can you deny the fact that you have been systematically platforming terrorists, not providing enough information about who they are or any information whatsoever, providing information? Another case that I want to mention, they actually platformed someone who said that he's a librarian and he spends his time in the library in Gaza and he's so appalled at the IDF because they destroyed the library in some school and some university. And when you look at this guy, he's actually an actual Hamas official. Like he's on Hamas's payroll. And they don't mention that at all, so that's misleading. You're misleading the public.
Yeah, and you yourself have taken part in some pretty hostile television interviews on international media, Ruth. It's very, very difficult to defend Israel.
Goodness, first of all, it's not difficult because I think that if you are full and whole with the truth, then I think you find it also very easy. I've heard you say that before and write that before. But the public opinion in general is being campaigned for by a very, very sophisticated mechanism funded by foreign money. And this has been also proved. A lot of Qatari money on the one hand from the extremist Sunni side of things of Islam, and on the other hand, a lot of Iranian or Shiite extreme Islamic money has gone into years of pre-positioning, in other words, creating and going into talking groups or discussion groups that are completely progressive and one would think have nothing to do with extreme Islamism, like Greenpeace, like LGBT.
Greta Thunberg.
Exactly. But they have been doing this systematically for years, very sophisticated and very smartly. And this is something we need to look at because this is not only against Israel. This is de facto and impregnatation, I don't even know if that's the right word, but really going into the West, sitting there and growing, and they say in Arabic, in interviews, taking over certain capitals. They even name them Rome, London, and so on.
Yeah, very worrying. All right, well, Trevor Asserson, who put that report together, will be on The Rundown with Benita Levine after this programme, so do stay tuned for that. Ruth Wasserman Lander and Khaled Hassan, thank you very much. See you both.
Thank you.
Now, a day after the United States confirmed Iran was providing Russia with ballistic missiles, the Russian foreign minister has met with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh. Sergei Lavrov is attending the Gulf Cooperation Council talks for the 7th time now. For more on that, we can go to Dubai. We're joined by our correspondent, Bastien Bory. So, Bastien, the Russians have a deepening partnership with Iran. They're also trying to build on their ties with the Saudis. What, though, is in it for Riyadh?
First, you know that countries like Saudi Arabia, as well as the UAE, have very bad relations with Hamas, which they accused of being too close, which they still accuse, actually, of being too close to Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. And the result is that Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have no power over talks and negotiations aimed at freeing Israeli hostages, at enforcing a ceasefire, and so on and so forth. And now we can see that the Saudis are trying to compensate a little by trying to bring Russia on board. Moscow has always had friendly relations with Hamas. The Russians have never designated them a terrorist organization, and they will support everything that can be a blow to U.S. interests. Hence, Sergei Lavrov's visit to Saudi Arabia, which is not just about Gaza. Vladimir Putin benefits from the chaos in Gaza, but also from a controlled, or rather controlled, chaos in some of the parts of the Middle East, because it means Western distraction from Ukraine. So, just like Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen are also part of these talks with Lavrov. Russia maintained its embassy in Yemen despite the war there. They abstained at the UN on arms embargoes resolutions against the Houthis. They welcomed their leaders in Moscow. So Riyadh has an interest in using the Kremlin to ensure that the Houthis don't drag the Saudis into their games and their strikes against oil tankers in the Red Sea.
And Bastien, what have the Saudis been saying then about their plans for a post-war Gaza?
Well, the idea is first the creation of a Palestinian state with Mohammed Dahlan as its bridgehead. Dahlan is the former head of the security of the Palestinian Authority. He's living in exile here in the UAE and is unanimously supported by the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the Americans. And Prince Mohammed bin Salman has pretty much a duty to impose this Palestinian state, not least because the Saudi population includes a large number of people who are very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and who are likely to turn against the government if a Palestinian state does not see the light of day. And then the second aspect is, of course, a large Saudi and Emirati financial investment in Gaza, with numerous investments in transport and tourism and industry and so on and so forth, to gain influence in the Near East.
And Bastien, the UAE and India have been holding trade talks on the sidelines of this meeting. Any developments there?
This could significantly boost trade and provide impetus to India, which was battered, as you know, by the pandemic and the lockdowns. The country is willing to boost exports with several nations, including the United Arab Emirates, India's third biggest trading partner, while India is the second largest partner of the UAE. And actually, the US and Israel are also looking for better access to the huge Indian market, because they have not established routes to the big Asian economies where the UAE has, especially when it comes to logistics. So the Americans, as well as the Israelis, will get a lot of benefit from sort of piggybacking on the work already achieved by the Emiratis.
Bastien, thank you very much. Bastien Bory there over in Dubai. Well, moving to Sudan now, where civilians continue to be targeted in brutal acts of ethnic violence. At least 21 people were killed and dozens more wounded after RSF militiamen opened fire on a market in the town of Sennar. This just a day after the country's military rulers rejected a call by UN experts for an independent force to come in and protect civilians. Millions of Sudanese have been displaced and are at risk of starvation because of the fighting between the RSF militia and the country's military rulers. Monim Haroun is Advocacy Director at HIAS, and he joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Monim. Yet more evidence today, though, that the RSF militia is targeting black Sudanese civilians. To what extent has this become an ethnic conflict?
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for having me and for shedding light on Sudan's overlooked crisis. But before please allow me, before I get to your question, to emphasize something that I said to you a few weeks ago in this program. Sudan is facing the worst humanitarian crisis in the planet right now, where the Sudanese people are trapped between 4 devastating factors with countless collateral impacts. There is the brutal war that has already claimed over 150,000 lives. 21 of them were just killed yesterday, as you just mentioned in your report. Around 11 million people have been forced to flee their homes. And second is the starvation and famine, as you just mentioned, where some regions are already been declared as region of famines and starvation, where people find it very difficult to access food and water and basic needs. And third is the spread of contagious diseases, where cholera is declared and claiming lives as we speak right now. And the fourth is the natural disasters, where floods are ravaging the country, causing immense damage for people of Sudan. So going back to your question, I think at this stage of the conflict, and as the UN report mentioned, the civilians are suffering from both sides. And I think it is hard to say which part of the conflicting parties are targeting civilians, because simply the war is everywhere in the country, impacting all the people of Sudan. And I think at this level where we are, and after 1 year and almost a half of this conflict, the Sudanese people are really impacted and really suffering from both conflicting countries, sides of the warring parties.
Well, as you say, it is more than a year and a half, and the international community appears to be completely out of ideas how to help Sudanese civilians. We did have this proposal from a UN panel to put in some kind of international force to try and protect civilians. I mean, how credible is that plan, do you think, and why did the military rulers just reject it outright?
Yeah, so 2 things. One, I believe the military government rejected the offer. I think as they officially said, they rejected it because it's illegal and it is out of the mandate of the UN body that wrote the report. But I think the real reason behind that could be in what the U.S. special envoy to Sudan suggested, that unfortunately the military government has other allies within Sudan that are interested in prolonging the war, because that is their only way to get back to rule the country. So it seems like the military government has not does not have fully control to decide whether they will be willing to protect the civilians or to have these forces that will protect the civilians. And with the issue itself, the deployment of impartial UN forces to protect the civilians, I think at this stage of the conflict, this could be the only solution that would provide some sort of protection for Sudanese civilians. As we see every day, Sudanese people are dying as a result of acts committed by both sides.
Yeah, world's worst humanitarian crisis. And as you say, Moneim, it is getting very little international coverage. So thank you very much for talking to us today. Moneim Haroun there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura.
Now, after a record performance at the Olympics, Israel has just made another record at the 2024 Paris Paralympics, winning 10 medals. More in this report.
The 2024 Paris Paralympics wrapped up on Sunday night with a rainy closing ceremony at the Stade de France. artists from the electronic scene played French classics for the 4,400 athletes as the Paralympic flag was passed to Karen Bass, mayor of Los Angeles, the next city to host the Games.
We decided to call this ceremony Paris is a Party, precisely because we want to celebrate and to create what is perhaps the biggest dance floor. So we celebrate the end of the Paralympic Games and also the end of this long series of sporting events by bringing together 24 French electronic music producers and DJs.
Israel's delegation was led by Ami Dadaon, who won 4 swimming medals, and Gal Hamrani, the captain of the women's goalball team, demonstrating just some of the success from the small country. Like at the Olympics earlier this summer, Team Israel faced threats and boycott efforts, some athletes refusing to face Israeli competitors. But this did not dampen their performance as they brought home 10 medals, 4 of which were gold, making this Israel's best showing since Athens 2004. History was also made at these games as their first ever medals in taekwondo and goalball were achieved. Ami Dadaon, Israel's most decorated Paralympian, won 2 golds, while taekwondo athlete Asaf Yassur and rower Moran Samuel won 1 each. A silver medal was won by the goalball team, Israel's first Paralympic team medal in 36 years. 5 million shekels will be paid out to these medal-winning athletes, grants that now apply equally to Olympians and Paralympians. With the Olympic season finished for 2024, Paralympic authorities have been looking ahead to Los Angeles 2028, specifically as a motivational goal for the thousands of IDF soldiers injured in Israel's war against Hamas, many of whom who are now using sports to cope with their new lives.
And congratulations to all the Paralympians who took part in Paris. Well, that brings us to the end of tonight's show. Many thanks for watching. Do stay tuned to i24 News. Benita Lippian is up next with tonight's rundown. Good night.
Sale for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad. With renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayazad.fr.
On today's program, tensions across the northern front intensify with a Hezbollah drone hitting an apartment building in Nahariya in northern Israel. How will the IDF respond? We go live to the scene for the latest. A series of strikes in Syria reports that 25 people have been killed in alleged Israeli strikes overnight, described as the most extensive in the past 11 months. We speak to a security expert about the implications. And media coverage of the war is under scrutiny. A new report on the BBC's coverage of the Hamas terror rampage and subsequent war is made public. It finds the British broadcaster breached its own editorial guidelines more than 1,500 times so far. We speak to the head researcher in London. This is the rundown on I24 News. I'm Benita Levine. Is a full-blown war across the northern front imminent? Former War Cabinet member Benny Gantz is suggesting Israel should take action in the north if a ceasefire hostage deal for Gaza is not secured soon. Hezbollah is today claiming responsibility for Monday morning's drone attack on an apartment building in Nahariya, though it says it was targeting an Israeli military base. The terror group in southern Lebanon also taking responsibility for a rocket barrage in the western Galilee, 339 days since the Hamas terror rampage and mass abduction in southern Israel on the 7th of October. Hezbollah showing its solidarity with Hamas in Gaza since then. Tens of thousands of residents of the north have been evacuated from their homes for almost a year. More in this report by our Emmanuel Honorat.
And the time of North has come, and actually I think we are late on this.
According to former Security Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz, that should be Israel's next move. Over the weekend, Gantz was in Washington, D.C., making the case for Israel at the annual summit advancing Middle East-American dialogue.
And I think that we should seek to have a deal to get our hostages out, but if we cannot get it in the coming time, I would say, I wouldn't limit it to days or a few weeks or whatever it is, we should go up north and take care and make sure we can get our people back to their homes. And I don't think we should delay it anymore.
Meanwhile, to help monitor the regional situation, IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi met with the Chief of the U.S. Army Central Command, General Michael Eric Kurilla, who arrived in Israel on Sunday. Halevi over the weekend also signaled Israel's plans to take the war to South Lebanon in order to fight Hezbollah. The region has been watching with bated breath Israel and Hezbollah's next move since October 8th, when Hezbollah decided to join Hamas in its war against Israel. Since then, both sides have been on the precipice of war, only waiting for one wrong push. In spite of Lebanon's official desire to stay out of a war with Israel, on Saturday night, the Lebanese Foreign Minister Abdullah Abu Habib told Al Jazeera that Israel passed a message through intermediaries indicating it is not interested in a ceasefire in Lebanon, even after one is reached with Hamas in Gaza.
So for more, it's a pleasure to welcome to studio Yaakov Lapin, Military and Strategic Affairs Analyst at the Miriam Institute and Jewish News Syndicate, and host of the podcast, The Lapin Assessment, on the Patreon site, and our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osran. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for being here. So much on the go. I want to start with you. Benny Gantz says it's time for action in the north. That time has come in the absence of a deal. We know there is no deal. Your thoughts on the mention from Benny Gantz, time to change focus?
Well, we're in this strange situation where it's clear that neither side in this conflict, neither Hezbollah and the Iranians behind them, and nor the Israeli cabinet want to move into a full-scale war. Hezbollah is perfectly comfortable to keep this as a war of attrition, as part of their long-standing pressure campaign to bombard the north, essentially to try and force Israel out of Gaza and to try and save what's left of Hamas and allow them to rebuild. And Israel also has been prioritizing the Gazan arena. But I think that, Benny Gantz has touched on something which is true here, which is the stop clock cannot continue like this forever. At some point, it's going to hit zero. At some point, whether the cabinet wants to or not, it's going to be forced to take action if this situation continues. And if everything is tied to Gaza, because Nasrallah is tying his attacks to the situation in Gaza, well, there's no sign at all that Gaza is going to end its conflict status. It is going to downgrade, I think. It's going to downgrade in intensity as time goes by. But that will be the test, because if the operations in Gaza become far less intense and Nasrallah continues to bombard the north, then I think Israel will really have no choice but to launch a major offensive in Lebanon. And that could possibly bring in the Iranians as well. We can't ignore the fact that the Iranian arena and the Lebanese arena are now intrinsically joined at the hip. And if one is activated, the other is likely to be activated as well.
We're going to have a deeper look at exactly that in a short while. Stay with us, gentlemen. There's much more to discuss. But right now, let's find out exactly what is happening on the ground. We cross live to our correspondent, Robert Swift. He joins us from northern Israel. And Rob, those red alert sirens sounding at various intervals throughout the day, including Shlomi, Arab al-Ramshek, Kfar Giladi, and others. And of course, that Hezbollah drone hitting an apartment in Nahariya earlier in the day. What is the latest there? What can you tell us?
So it's been about 5 hours since any sirens went off, but it has actually been an extremely busy day with regards to cross-border fire. There's been attacks across the length of the border, both in the Kiryat Shmona area in the east and in the Shlomi area in the west, as well as central points. Now, in a recent update from the IDF, they've said that in one of those attacks that took place along the border earlier today, 3 drones crossed the border and in a series of explosions, 2 soldiers were wounded. It's understood that they are in a light condition. Their injuries are not serious, but they have been evacuated to hospital. Now, you also mentioned the drone incident which took place in Nahariya, another serious attack. This one taking place a bit further south than has been seen in recent days and weeks. 2 drones making it into the Nahariya area, one of them exploding against the outside wall of a residential tower block. We were on scene there earlier today, seeing some of that damage with the explosion penetrating through the main wall of the building into the home of a family who was living there. That no casualties in that incident, but from the shrapnel that was scattered around the car park of the building, it was, and from the size of the blast damage to the building itself, it was clear that it could very easily have been an incident which resulted in casualties.
And in the meantime, we know Hezbollah saying it was targeting an Israeli military base, yet it keeps on actually hitting residential areas. Whether or not they are empty is a separate discussion. We also know big meetings happening with CENTCOM. Any light you can share right now?
Yeah, the minute a lot of the sort of the mood talk does seem to be with regards to a likely escalation. Perhaps the U.S. brass are in Israel in order to coordinate with the IDF so that they can assess for themselves the IDF's plans, possibly pertaining to an expansion of the military activity on the Israeli northern border. You know, with perchance that could also result in increased Israeli activity inside Lebanon itself. At the minute, it's not clear in which direction it's going. This has happened before. On numerous occasions, we've talked in the past about potential escalation taking place here, or even the possibility of Israeli land incursions into South Lebanon. That hasn't happened in the past, but it is worth reminding our audience that August was the month in which we saw the single largest amount of cross-border fire coming from Hezbollah. And in communities like Nahariya, where we're standing, it's clear that the residents feel forgotten, that they are concerned that this community, which is, let's remind our audience, it's a fairly bustling town. They're concerned that this location if enough pressure comes from Hezbollah, it could end up like Kiryat Shmona, a town, a city with the vast majority of its population evacuated. Now, in order to prevent that from happening, there is increasing pressure on the IDF to do something, on the leaders of Israel to do something. And when push comes to shove, that may end up meaning an escalation here on the Israel-Lebanon border.
Thank you so much. Correspondent Robert Swift, live from northern Israel. Appreciate the update. Thank you, Rob. And now, meanwhile, a series of airstrikes overnight in Syria attributed to the Israeli Air Force are believed to be related to Israeli preparations for the possibility of a major military campaign in Lebanon, as we've been discussing. At least 25 people were killed in what is believed to be the most significant Israeli strike in Syria since the start of the war. The attacks, carried out in 4 waves, are considered to be unusual, both in the extended duration of the attack and the scope of targets spread across multiple Syrian cities. Middle East correspondent Ariel Osaran has the details in this report.
An unusual series of airstrikes rocked western Syria early Monday. Syrian state media accused Israel of launching 4 waves of airstrikes on various areas in the Syrian countryside.
We were sitting at home when we heard an explosion. We went out to see what happened. I was told that blocks from the building had fallen on my car and that the windshield and rear window were completely broken. Thank God nothing serious happened.
At least 15 missiles struck targets in Homs, Hama, Tartus, and Masyaf, home to the Syrian Scientific Studies and Research Center, known as SIRS. This is where Hezbollah and Iran's Revolutionary Guard develops short and medium-range precision missiles and drones. Official state media claimed some of the missiles were intercepted. Syrian opposition media said 25 people were killed in the airstrikes, marking the deadliest attack in Syria attributed to Israel since the war began in October. 5 of the casualties were civilians and the rest Syrian soldiers or members of pro-Iranian militias. 32 others were wounded. Israel did not comment on the strikes.
We strongly condemn this criminal attack by the Zionist regime on Syrian soil. We believe that the time has long come for the supporters of the regime to stop arming the regime. We deny allegations by some Zionist-affiliated media about an Iranian-backed or Iranian-dependent center having been attacked.
Despite taking a back seat in the current conflict against Israel, Syria continues to serve Hezbollah and Iranian proxies as a hub for storing and producing weapons. The targeting of such sites is believed to set the stage for a broader conflict in Lebanon that could erupt at a moment's notice.
And that report by our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osaran, who is here in studio. And Ariel, we were talking earlier in the show with Yaakov about the threats out of Lebanon, the threats out of Iran. Talk to us about the way Syria is tied into potential developments across the northern front.
Yeah, you would imagine with the build-up towards October 7th or even in the immediate aftermath that Syria would find itself aligned in active combat with Israel, as we were seeing in Lebanon, as well as Gaza, the West Bank. But that is not the case, and that, I think, is interesting, and it also highlights that the Iranian axis of proxies is not completely unified in their interests regarding attacks against Israel. Now, this also highlights the current role that Syria is playing in this axis, more of a storage base or an area that hosts different arms depots or that facilitates a transfer of weapons, but not as a front from which attacks originate against Israel. Now, that does happen, not at the same scale as southern Lebanon, but Syria has appeared to be more of a rear support front to Hezbollah, and that is the concern. That at a time of war, if indeed the situation with Hezbollah in Lebanon were to escalate into a full open conflict, that Syria would engage more actively, not only in supporting from the rear, but also carrying out attacks. And so targeting weapons depots as well as this SIRS site, a site integral part of Hezbollah's missile precision project. This is something that indicates that indeed the IDF, if they're behind this strike, they most likely are not going to confirm, they haven't until now, that they're setting the stage for the moment when it is engaged in open conflict to remove the reinforcement capabilities, the rearming capabilities, the second wave capabilities that Hezbollah and Iran hope to use Syria for that goal. And so we see that despite 11 months of this war, with continuous alleged Israeli airstrikes in Syria, Syria has not yet joined the fray, and that I think is a sign of optimism in trying to understand this whole axis of Iranian proxies currently engaged against Israel.
And Yaakov, your assessment on these strikes in Syria, unusual because of the scope, as we were hearing in that report. What do you understand this all to mean? Tie it all together with this axis of evil.
Well, the Iranians have certainly been trying to turn Syria into another war front, just as they have turned Lebanon and Gaza into war fronts against Israel. And Syria is the one arena where the Israeli Air Force has for many, many years been active in preventing, according to some assessments, something like 70% of all attempts by Iran to smuggle weapons into Syria have been destroyed on the way. And that's apparently what caused the Iranians to switch tactics and to try and produce precision-guided missiles, as Ariel just mentioned, and other kinds of weapons on Syrian territory in order to reduce the exposure to Israeli intelligence and attacks. And one of the places where this has been happening in a very intensive manner is the SIRS, this Syrian Scientific Center, which has essentially been co-opted and taken over by the Quds Force. And they have a site called Site 4000. There's a lot of research about this at the Alma Center. This site is a place where they have taken things like the Fatah 110 ballistic missile, turned it into a precision weapon, and kept it for Hezbollah so that they could quickly get it across the border to Lebanon. I suspect that a lot of this precision-guided missile work, the design, the engineering, was the target, or at least one of the targets of the recent strikes. They may have also gone after air defenses. I wouldn't necessarily link it to an upcoming offensive in Lebanon. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case, because if there is alarming intelligence coming out of activity in Sirte, that in its own sort of right, its own merit, could spark a large-scale strike. So there's a lot we don't know, but certainly this is a place where the Iranians have been developing ballistic precision missiles for Hezbollah, and I suspect that that's got something to do with this strike.
Very briefly, are we likely to see more strikes like the ones overnight?
So it's very much up to the Iranians, but the thing is that they never give up. So even if 70% of what they sent to Syria didn't get through, 30% did, and that's enough to incentivize them to continue. And they're building weapons in Syria. So this has been hit, but what hasn't been hit, we don't necessarily know. So there's this relentless effort by Iran. And the only thing that's going to stop them, unfortunately, is a collapse of the Iranian regime. As long as that regime is standing in Tehran with its ideological obsession of destroying Israel and surrounding it with a ring of fire, they are going to continue to try and take over Syria, and Israel will have to continue to deal with that threat.
Relentless indeed. Gentlemen, stay with us. We've got much more to discuss. We turn to another developing top story. There was a sense of hope, then cautious optimism, now broad pessimism. Sources telling Israeli media the chances of a ceasefire hostage agreement based on the current negotiations are, quote, close to zero. Hamas is adding new demands over the release of convicted Palestinian terrorists. Benjamin Netanyahu is adamant the IDF cannot leave the Philadelphia corridor along the Gaza-Egypt border. The Prime Minister saying Israel needs to stop another October 7th from happening in the future. Senior correspondent Bianca Zanini has more in this report.
The bustling city of Tel Aviv once again brought to a halt as large groups of protesters took over the streets, blocking traffic and demanding the Israeli government secure a ceasefire for hostages deal in Gaza.
What we see over the last week is that the hostages are dying, actually being murdered. The families are getting sick and are suffering and the entire Israel is sick. The only medicine is to bring back the hostages.
But according to new reports, Israeli negotiators say the chances of an agreement reached on the basis of Israel's May proposal, which has been on the table for the past 3 months, are, quote, close to zero. The unnamed sources in the Israeli security establishment also reported broad pessimism and say that even the U.S. is now unlikely to follow through on its plan to present a new bridging proposal in the next few days. According to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been widely criticized for not doing enough to reach a deal, the Israeli public stands united in the war against Hamas.
Newspaper Bild published an official Hamas document that reveals its plan of action: to sow division within us, to wage psychological warfare on the families of the hostages, to exert internal and external political pressure on the Israeli government to tear us apart from the inside, and to continue the war until further notice. Until further notice means the defeat of Israel. The vast majority of Israeli citizens do not fall into this trap of Hamas. They know that we are committed with all our might to achieving the goals of the war.
But after 11 months of war and with no end in sight, not everyone is on the same page. Less than 2 weeks ago, Hamas murdered 6 hostages right before they could be rescued by the IDF, adding fuel to the fire of fearful and frustrated family members.
We came to say to the war cabinet that they must get the right decision and sign a deal that will get our son out of the hell.
As hope once again fades for a deal that would halt the war and return the hostages, protests continue throughout Israel.
Heartbreaking for the families of 101 hostages still in captivity, and still no clarity, of course, as to how many of those hostages are alive. Yaakov Lapin, when we hear Israeli negotiators saying the chance of an agreement reached on the basis of current negotiations are close to zero, according to sources speaking to Israeli media, and many argue military pressure is the way to go. How so?
Well, look, the real issue here hasn't actually changed, since November, since the last hostage deal, which is that Hamas is demanding, it's not really only about Philadelphia, it's about an Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip.
Right.
And in exchange for that, Hamas is willing to release approximately half of the hostages that it has in its possessions, and which it's obviously treating in such an appalling manner, and whose situation is desperate. So that is the deal on the table. And therefore, right now, the fact that they have not moved from that means that, as far as Hamas is concerned, this is their primary survival strategy. They're holding on to those hostages. There's also no guarantee that they would release the second stage of hostages if that ever came to pass, because that's really the only insurance policy that Yahya Sinwar has. So I understand those who question military pressure. Military pressure is what, in my opinion, did lead to the first successful hostage deal. And right now, I think Israel cannot rely only on military pressure. I agree with that. It also needs diplomatic pressure coming to bear from the United States and the Gulf states and the Arab world, those that are, rational, moderate partners of the West in the Arab world, on Hamas. Because as long as Hamas sees that the pressure is going on to Israel, it's going to harden its position and say this is working, and Israel is going to be torn and split into two, polarized blocks. This is exactly what Hamas wants to see. If they see an international community that's clear that the pressure has to go to them, I think that will actually also contribute. So it can't only be military pressure, it also has to be diplomatic pressure placed on Hamas, which is active throughout, the Middle East. Qatar, they're still living in hotels in Qatar. Why is that allowed to continue when they're holding hostages and contravening every possible clause of the Geneva Convention? Why are they allowed to stay in hotels? So there's a lot more that can be done off the military battlefield as well.
Who are the players globally who could be talking to those people that you alluded to in luxury hotels in Doha as we speak, putting pressure on them to put pressure on Hamas to reach an agreement?
So, it would be the Americans that would need to come down like a ton of bricks on the Qataris. And that's not so easy for the Americans to do because, the largest air base that the U.S. uses is in Qatar, which in itself is a bit questionable. And I think the United States has to reassess that dependency. But really, it's the American pressure on Qatar that could lead to a change in Qatari policy, because right now, Qatar is dancing at two weddings, as people like to say here. It's enjoying its relationship with Hamas, with the Iranians, with the Americans, even with Israel, and it's paying very little price for the fact that it is hosting Hamas's overseas political leadership, Khaled Mashal, etc. There are other countries that also could be pressured, but I think let's start with there. Get some clarity about where the address for the pressure should be. As long as that doesn't happen, I wouldn't see why Hamas feels any urgency in softening up its positions.
And Ariel, I want to bring you in here because we hear about low-level talks and meetings underway, but no outcome. And then you hear these reports, zero chance of a deal, beyond devastating for families waiting for some kind of clarity about their loved ones.
Not only devastating, but really the families currently don't have any horizon or source for optimism regarding the success of these talks. We talked about the 6 hostages who were executed last week by Hamas as IDF forces approached, putting into question the efficacy of this mantra of only military pressure will bring out the hostages. So today, this morning in the Knesset, the mother of Yagev Buchstab, who was a 34-year-old who was taken hostage from Kibbutz Nirim, along with his wife Rimon, who was freed in the first deal back in November. She said today in the Knesset that the army informed her that her son, who was killed last month, his body was returned last month, he was also executed in a similar way when IDF forces approached the area and then killed him. So what Israelis want to see happen now, obviously they understand, the vast majority of Israelis understand that the sole responsibility for what happened lies with Hamas, but they still do not feel that their government is doing absolutely everything in its power to bring upon a deal.
Looking in the face of evil of Hamas. Gentlemen, stay with us. There's much more to discuss right now. A very quick break. When we get back, media coverage of the war abroad. Stay tuned.
Sale for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad, with renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayazad.fr.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to The Rundown. There has been much scrutiny over the media coverage of the 11-month war, a war started by Hamas on the 7th of October. The BBC anti-Israel bias sparking much outrage in this part of the world and elsewhere. It doesn't refer to Hamas as a terror group, even though it's designated as such in the UK. Now, a report conducted by a British law firm finding that the BBC had breached its own editorial guidelines more than 1,500 times during its war coverage so far. That coverage associates Israel with genocide over 14 times more than Hamas, the group that conducted the terror rampage and mass abduction, and today continues holding 101 people hostage in Gaza. So for more, we welcome live from London, Trevor Assison, founder and senior partner at Assison Law Offices and the head of this research project. Trevor, thank you so much for joining us today. So there are staggering examples of anti-Israel bias through the lens of the BBC, infuriating and upsetting many, all while Hamas leaders vow to repeat October 7th style attacks again and again. The BBC associates Israel with genocide. Your report has specific numbers. So to start, tell us how this research was conducted, analysing some 9 million words of BBC content. Tell us more.
Okay, thank you. I am a litigation solicitor. That's my background. And what I did when I heard that various people felt the BBC wasn't getting this story right is I used my litigation experience to decide that I should put together the material that could possibly be used to bring a claim against the BBC for breach of its actual regulations and its own rules, which under which it operates. And so I recorded all the BBC principal news output for a period of 4 months. And then I hired a team of external lawyers to analyse what amounted to be about 9 million words of, as you said, of both UK broadcasting in English and also Arab BBC Arabic. And what we did is we tried to classify the extent to which the BBC had actually complied with its obligations of impartiality. Simultaneously with that, a group of mostly Israeli-based data scientists, including professors from the Hebrew University and Ben Gurion University, under the leadership of Haran Shani-Narkis, put together an analysis and a whole load of experiments so that we could analyze this work from a deep data perspective using data science tools. This is something quite novel, so that not only were we able to use traditional legal methods, but we were also able to combine that with the deep data, dive into this.
Right.
And as a result, we were able to substantiate each approach substantiated the other and gave it further strength.
Astounding to think that in the face of the October 7th massacre, the BBC has managed to downplay the Hamas brutality and the depravity, much of which was, of course, all filmed by terrorists themselves. So you're talking about this novel way that you analyze the content. What are some of the examples that stood out for you in terms of their coverage?
Well, some of the most remarkable examples were on October the 7th itself, which was a day in which the news around the world was sympathetic to Israel, that had suffered the worst brutal attack there's probably ever been seen in the world, because this was all filmed by the perpetrators as they were performing these horrendous acts. The sympathy in BBC Arabic was greater for the Palestinians than it was for the Israelis who were being attacked. And that's an extraordinary thing. Another extraordinary fact is that Hamas, as you said, a proscribed terrorist organization, is more likely to be described by the BBC as a health ministry than it is as a proscribed terrorist organization. We measured the way in which some of the main outlets in British news, the Newsnight, Breakfast TV and one other channel were looking at the crisis, at the war, and they were at times 90 or 95, even 100% of their non-neutral coverage was anti-Israel. There's fact after fact. In order to make the 200-page report a little easier to read, we put in a lot of pictures, a lot of graphs, and so that some of these facts really leap off the page. Another fact, which is absolutely extraordinary, we looked at the corrections the BBC made, that is to say, where the BBC itself admitted that it had got the story wrong.
Right.
And there, 100% of the major errors were really quite viciously anti-Israel stories, which were totally untrue.
And again, you made mention of the fact regarding the numbers, the figures coming out of Gaza, crediting numbers that were attributed to Hamas, the terror group who conducted the rampage in the first place. Trevor, how does the BBC get away with this? This isn't a campus radio station, it's the BBC. What happens next in terms of multiple breaches of its own editorial guidelines?
Yes. Well, I'm quite sure that there are many campus radio stations that are doing a much better job at accurate reporting than the BBC.
Fair point.
You're absolutely right to ask that question. How do they get away with it? And the answer is that people haven't actually done the one thing that needs to be done, unfortunately, which is to bring a claim against them for breach of their own rules. They are getting £4 billion from the British population through the license fee, which many people are upset about, because people who really don't support the BBC, don't even watch the BBC, are forced to pay this money to an organisation. The only real excuse that the BBC has for being allowed to receive this money is that they will provide balanced, impartial news. And frankly, if they totally fail to do that, then they're really breaching their contract with the British people. And of course, the effects of that breach are felt around the world, not least in Israel, which is where I live, which is where my law firm sits, and where we as a firm are, all of us, deeply troubled and upset by what has actually been going on at the BBC.
It certainly is very troubling indeed, and as you say, has implications here and elsewhere. Is there a credible media watchdog or the like to sanction the broadcaster over this? What has the response been like so far to your report?
Well, the response to our report has actually been very gratifying and almost overwhelming. The number of people who feel very encouraged that finally, having believed that the BBC was really breaching its obligations, they've got in their hands absolute proof that that's the case, that their suspicions were right. And that's the media watch that has really been conducted by us, and it will form, I believe, the foundation for taking this further. Either the BBC will take a mature approach to the report and accept that it has been getting the story wrong and start to try to actually put its house in order. Sadly, I think that the chances of that are slim to nil, because in the past the BBC has been very, very bad at recognising its own defects. And if that's not the case, then we're going to have to go to the British court, just as in Israel, where the courts are independent and are able to criticise government bodies. Similarly, as in all liberal democracies, in England also, the courts have the authority to be independent of government and government-funded bodies and to criticise them. So we can, I think, rely on an independent judge to look at the facts that we have assembled and to see that there is a fundamental and ongoing breach by the BBC of its obligations.
And obviously the concern about that kind of bias isn't only focused on the BBC. If we looked abroad in the US, you had a news anchor rolling her eyes as relatives of hostages were interviewed. Perhaps your next research can extend globally. Very briefly, is this kind of research going to extend to other broadcasters too?
Well, what I can tell you is that I'm launching a campaign for media for media standards that is going to produce another report, a separate report to mine, which will also demonstrate massive failures by the BBC over time, looking at a significant period of coverage during this war. Whether or not we extend that, we go on to extend that to other news broadcasters is something which is definitely being borne in mind. It is a terrible problem that the media is irresponsibly reporting this story, like so many other stories. I don't want to suggest that the Israel-Hamas war is the only story in the world that is being badly reported. Bad news is bad for democracy, it's bad for liberal society, it's bad for the people that consume that news. And journalists really need to have their responsibilities, they need to take their responsibilities seriously. They can have an effect on society, they can have a very damaging effect in all sorts of ways, and major political decisions can be made on the basis of bad news. So we're trying to take a step in the right direction. We're hoping that we can call the BBC to account and effect the change that's so desperately needed.
A fascinating issue, such an important conversation. Thank you so much for your insights. Trevor Assison, live on I24 News. Thank you so much for being with us on The Rundown.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Fascinating indeed. And now, the Palestinian Authority has submitted a draft resolution to the United Nations General Assembly, which could come up for a vote next week and is already drawing blowback from Israel's foreign ministry. The resolution demands a complete IDF withdrawal from so-called occupied territory within 6 months, the evacuation of all Jews from the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem, including the Old City, and the enforcement of all relevant decisions by the International Court of Justice. It also calls for the halt of trade or economic or weapons dealings with Israel wherever so-called occupied territory is concerned, and a ban on countries opening embassies in Jerusalem, along with a host of other provisions. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, the UN High Commissioner Volker Turk sharing this message at the start of a Human Rights Council session in Geneva, talking about prioritizing an end to the war.
Ending the war and averting a full-blown regional conflict is an absolute and urgent priority. Equally, the wider situation of illegality across the occupied Palestinian territory, deriving from Israel's policies and practices, as so clearly spelled out by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion in July, must be comprehensively addressed. States must not and cannot accept blatant disregard for international law, including binding decisions of the Security Council and orders of the International Court of Justice, neither in this nor any other situation.
So for more, we now go live to our senior US correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. Joins us from Washington. Good to see you, Mike. The Palestinian Authority packing in a lot of demands in this draft resolution. Walk us through what this means in practice, though.
So this was all based off of a decision that came down from the International Court of Justice in July. And what that decision said, and it wasn't really a decision in the end, the court was presented with a fact in advance that this occupation of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, of Eastern Jerusalem, of the Golan Heights, is illegal. And the question before the ICJ is, well, what do you want to do with that information? The ICJ issued an advisory opinion saying that this occupation, as they term it, needs to come to an end and right quick. And now the Palestinians, not surprisingly at all, are using that non-binding advisory opinion as a path forward in different venues, whether it be at the UN, whether it be in other courts, whether it be diplomatically, to try to advance their cause and to try to bring more penalties and punishments against Israel. So the UN General Assembly will be that first avenue in which to try to do that. Now, the UN General Assembly resolution is also non-binding. So what does it all mean in the end? Well, now the Palestinians, after that passes, and it will pass, there's no doubt about it, can now move forward and say, listen, the ICJ has made its opinion known, the UN General Assembly has made its opinion known, now they can go to other countries, other businesses, other international organizations, and start to get the ball rolling on what they will try to implement in terms of sanctions, in terms of severing of diplomatic relations, in terms of disassociation in trade agreements, what have you. So this is just the one avenue for all that to happen. What does it mean in practice in the end? Well, I think that's longer term really to be discussed here, because everything right now seems to be within the prism, within the context of the war itself. And there's a second piece, Benita, here to this puzzle as well, and that will be the American reaction to all of this. It's obvious what Israel's reaction is, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But will the Americans, how much will the Americans pressure the Palestinians, A, to back off completely, which is probably a non-starter for Ramallah, or to at least amend and soften this draft resolution before it actually comes up for a vote? The text that we've seen so far is only the first draft. It could go and probably will go through several revisions before it comes up for a final vote. What kind of pressure Washington will apply, I think, might have an impact as well.
So then, if you're looking at the Israeli Foreign Ministry already issuing a rebuke, tell us what that contains.
Well, Israel Katz, not known for soft language to begin with, the Israeli Foreign Minister, Israel Katz, saying that if the Palestinians move ahead with this resolution as it is, he will break the Palestinian Authority, and his actions will lead to the PA's dissolution. That's pretty harsh language and probably hyperbole to a large extent, but nevertheless makes clear Israel's position here, that if the Palestinians move forward with this and try to turn the UN against Israel once again and again, set it up for further punishments diplomatically down the line from the rest of the world, that it will pay a steep penalty. Will it lead to the dissolution of the Palestinian Authority? Israeli ministers in one form or fashion have promised that for many decades now. It's probably not going to happen in this particular case, but it could create a tit for tat that leads to larger consequences here in the Israeli-Palestinian Authority relationship in a very, very tenuous time to begin with.
We will be watching. On top of all the latest developments, as always, senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim, live from Washington. Thank you, Mike. Now, an unusual incident on a highway in Israel. 13 terror suspects in a shuttle bus arrested on Route 6 on Monday, apparently intending to carry out an attack. The road was blocked to traffic as police from Rosh Ha'ayin examined their vehicle. The main suspect is a Palestinian man who entered illegally from the West Bank. Now, authorities say the incident has been handled. Meanwhile, in Jordan, thousands of people have been celebrating on the streets of Amman after Sunday's terror attack at the Allenby Bridge. A Jordanian truck driver killed 3 Israeli civilians at that crossing between Jordan and the West Bank before he was shot dead. Palestinian terror groups praising the attack. The terrorist's father believes he acted alone.
When people follow the news of what's happening in Palestine and Gaza and in Jerusalem, their blood boils. So I believe that this was the basis of why he did the operation, because we did not know anything about this before. He does not belong to any organizations. He is retired from the army. He has his own path and has nothing to do with any parties or anything of the sort. It was an individual act that he came up with on his own.
Still in studio, Yaakov Lapin and Ariel Osran. And of course, Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty back in 1994 and have close security ties, given that those scenes of jubilation in the streets of Jordan after this fatal terror attack on Sunday were jarring to see, but not surprising to all. Your thoughts?
Not surprising at all. Look, the Hashemite kingdom has been walking down this fine rope for a long time now, even before this war, where, behind the scenes, they maintain very close security cooperation with Israel. They have all the same enemies, Iran, Hamas, Islamists that would love to topple this kingdom and basically end Jordan's role as Israel's strategic depth against the entire Iranian jihadist axis to the east. But within Jordan, there is wild incitement, daily incitement against the state of Israel. There's anti-Semitic incitement. There's a call to cancel the peace treaty. It's a very hostile population. The fact that approximately 60% of it is originally Palestinian is also going to contribute to that. So they have a direct stake in this conflict. So all in all, the kingdom continues to walk down this very delicate, balancing rope. And this is a very, problematic and complex situation. Israel's interest is, on the one hand, yes, to maintain security cooperation with the Jordanian security forces. There are going to be some tough questions about the competence of those forces letting a gunman terrorist in past the Jordanian side. That has to be looked at very carefully. And I don't think Israel needs to be shy about publicly demanding answers, because there has been a tendency of Israeli officials keeping these kinds of demands for transparency behind closed doors. No, I think it's perfectly fine to publicly demand. We've lost 3 innocent lives here. But at the end of the day, Israel's interest is in cooperating with the Jordanian security forces and making sure that those Islamist, Hamas, Iranian forces don't have their way and don't destabilize the kingdom.
And Ariel, parliamentary elections in Jordan tomorrow, promising to be the most consequential in decades. Tell us more. There's lots at stake.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake, and it comes at a challenging time, as Yaakov described. The ongoing war in Gaza and the growing gap between the sentiment in the street among the Jordanian public and the top leadership of the kingdom. I'm not talking about the political leadership, because at times that is more aligned with the sentiment in the street. But we're talking specifically King Abdullah II, not quite sure how far that moderate view of Israel extends, but as far as the interests, security interests of Jordan are concerned, I completely agree with Yaakov. They want to see a continuation of relations with Israel, but when you work on that and at the same time you have to quell discontent in the streets, growing discontent, becoming even more vocal as the war extends, that makes it very challenging for the Hashemite royal court. I think the test tomorrow is whether radical Islamist elements manage to extend or increase their sway in parliament. That will be a big test, not only to Jordan, but for Israel and its relations with Jordan, as it hopes to continue to move forward in this security cooperation, with the hope that it doesn't come at the expense of public opinion in Jordan.
We certainly will be following all those developments. Ariel Ossuran, Yaakov Lapin, thank you so much, both of you, for being here in studio. Appreciate your insights. Changing gears now, positive news, sports news. Israel achieving its best performance in 20 years at the 2024 Paris Paralympics, winning 10 medals despite the threats and calls for boycotts. Swimmer Ami Dadon and rower Moran Samuel coming home with gold medals, as our Jody Natilovitz explains in this report.
The 2024 Paris Paralympics wrapped up on Sunday night with a rainy closing ceremony at the Stade de France. Artists from the electronic scene played French classics for the 4,400 athletes as the Paralympic flag was passed to Karen Bass, mayor of Los Angeles, the next city to host the Games.
We decided to call this ceremony Paris is a Party, precisely because we want to celebrate and to create what is perhaps the biggest dance floor. So we celebrate the end of the Paralympic Games and also the end of this long series of sporting events by bringing together 24 French electronic music producers and DJs.
Israel's delegation was led by Ami Dadaon, who won 4 swimming medals, and Gal Hamrani, the captain of the women's goalball team, demonstrating just some of the success from the small country. Like at the Olympics earlier this summer, Team Israel faced threats and boycott efforts, some athletes refusing to face Israeli competitors. but this did not dampen their performance as they brought home 10 medals, 4 of which were gold, making this Israel's best showing since Athens 2004. History was also made at these games as their first ever medals in taekwondo and goalball were achieved. Ami Dadaon, Israel's most decorated Paralympian, won 2 golds, while taekwondo athlete Asaf Yassur and rower Moran Samuel won 1 each. A silver medal was won by the goalball team, Israel's first Paralympic team medal in 36 years. 5 million shekels will be paid out to these medal-winning athletes, grants that now apply equally to Olympians and Paralympians. With the Olympic season finished for 2024, Paralympic authorities have been looking ahead to Los Angeles 2028, specifically as a motivational goal for the thousands of IDF soldiers injured in Israel's war against Hamas, many of whom are now using sports to cope with their new lives.
And that report by our Jody Natilovitz. Thank you. And on that positive note, we wrap up the rundown for today. I'm Benita Levine, live in Tel Aviv. Thank you for watching.